to withdraw from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court has been submitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations in accordance with Article 127(1) of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
After years of discontent, Africa has now turned its threats into actions. Burundi, South Africa and the Gambia have become the first three countries to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, with more expected to follow suit. Leaders on the continent have long called the court an instrument of modern colonialism, noting that all of those convicted have been Africans. But others have urged Africa to reaffirm its commitment to justice, saying the ICC is the last resort to which many victims of mass atrocities can turn to. So will the decision of these three countries spur the rest of the continent into similar action? And can the court survive Africa's ICC exit? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The withdrawal decisions by Burundi, South Africa and the Gambia represent another low point in the continent's relations with the ICC. Now, most African nations signed up to the court voluntarily, but in recent years, several have been questioning its agenda. CCTV's Clementine Logan has more.
It started in Bujumbura, when Burundi's parliament voted overwhelmingly to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, becoming the first country to do so.
Burundi has come to the realization that the International Criminal Court has become an instrument to put pressure on governments from poor countries as a means to destabilize them. We have noted with regret that the International Criminal Court only targets African nationals, who are the only ones who are prosecuted by the court, as if the rest of the world is immune to human rights abuses.
A week later, South Africa became number 2, when Justice Minister Michael Masuta said that the tribunal's obligations are inconsistent with the country's laws, which give sitting leaders diplomatic immunity.
South Africa will work closely with the African Union and the other countries in Africa to strengthen continental bodies such as the African Court on Human and People's Rights, created to deal with such crimes and to prosecute the perpetrators, whilst at the same time continuing to participate and honor its commitments under international human rights instruments.
This week, the Gambia became number 3 when Information Minister Sheriff Bojang said not a single Western war criminal has been indicted, and that the withdrawal is warranted by the fact that the ICC, despite being called International Criminal Court, is in fact an international Caucasian court for the persecution and humiliation of people of colour, especially Africans. The African Union has led the charge against the ICC. It's long accused the court of bias and racism and now wants its entire membership to withdraw. Kenya is also a big critic, particularly after the ICC's attempt to put President Uhuru Kenyatta on trial. Kenya sees the ICC as a vehicle that strayed off course to the detriment of our sovereignty, security and dignity as Africans. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn says the ICC serves Western interests and that the court is not the place for justice. Other critics include Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe and Uganda's leader Yoweri Museveni, who used his own inauguration earlier this year to brand the court a bunch of useless people. The court still has some supporters on the continent, among them Botswana. This week, Botswana's foreign ministry said they are convinced that as the only permanent international criminal tribunal, the ICC is an important and unique institution in the international criminal justice system. Botswana therefore wishes to reaffirm its membership of the Rome Statute. The United Nations has confirmed receipt of both Burundi and South Africa's intentions to withdraw.
Over the last 2 decades, the world has made enormous strides towards the development of a global system of international criminal justice with the ICC at its core. And the Secretary General also recalls the significant role played by South Africa in the establishment of the Rome Statutes and the ICC, with in fact South Africa being one of the first countries to sign on to the Rome Statutes.
As it stands, all 6 cases currently being heard at the ICC relate to Africa. Some of the world's most powerful nations, including China and the US, are not signatories to the Rome Statute, while Africa remains the biggest bloc in the world to sign on. A continental exodus would be a major blow for the court. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
Well, the African Union has been a source of criticism on the ICC for some time. And in January of 2016, it set up a committee to explore a strategy for ICC withdrawal. CCTV's Girum Chala spoke to Adewale Iyanda, the legal counsel for the African Union Commission, to get their response to their recent decisions.
Is the African Union Commission surprised by South Africa's decision to pull out of the International Criminal Court?
The chairperson spoke on this issue. I think she's addressed the press. And she's clearly indicated that, one, it's a sovereign decision of a member state to sign up and ratify an international treaty. Likewise, it is a sovereign right to withdraw. It's for that reason it's provided for under the Rome Statute. So I don't see any issue with that.
Are the reasons valid from the African perspective of walking out of the International Criminal Court? And what are the alternative solutions of providing continual justice in the African continent?
From the perspective of member states, they're looking for an improved system within the International Criminal Court system that addresses the concerns of the member states. I think the debate must be looked at within that larger context. The international community should address their minds to as well is the African Union mechanism that they're currently trying to set up through the Malabo Protocol that was adopted sometime in 2014, which would expand the jurisdiction of the current African Court of Justice and Human Rights to be able to deal with these crimes. Of course, the International Criminal Court was always meant as a court of last resort. And as such, crimes or perpetrators of crimes can always be tried at the national level, where the relevant laws exist, but even as we're trying to do even at the regional level. But also there have been other mechanisms that have been used, ad hoc tribunals, hybrid tribunals. The recent case in Hiss and Hybrid trial is a case in point. And so there are other mechanisms. The International Criminal Court cannot prosecute all international crimes. So it's just one piece in a huge body of mechanisms that are out there to deal with these issues. So,
what would this mean for the International Criminal Court's credibility as a whole?
I think it has been clear that the Rome Statute system has not been perfect. Of course, there is almost no international treaty that is perfect, of course. And there have been concerns that, as I indicated, have been raised consistently by Africans. I'm not sure you can wave that away easily. I think those within the Rome Statutes, the stakeholders, the UN Security Council, stakeholders within the ICC system, should really look at these issues. Of course, if some of the concerns that have been outlined is a reason for or motivation for some of these states pulling out, I think they need to really look at what the bigger picture is in terms of, sustaining the Rome Statute system. And of course, Africa is, depending on number of withdrawals, the largest bloc. I don't think that's a voice that should easily be ignored. I think the whole, from what we're getting from the reactions basically to these, just shows clearly that it's an issue that should seriously be considered for the stakeholders basically. on ensuring that there are reforms that are brought to the system so that at the end of the day, you know, everyone who's part of that family feels like they are part of that family.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, my expert guests will offer further analysis on Africa's ICC exit. To stay with us.
It seems important to us that strong initiatives should be taken by African states as well as by the international community to find a solution to this situation. And also, we would like to seize this potential chance and opportunity to appeal first to a constructive dialogue within the Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute to reach a dynamic consensus. Secondly, make up this assembly to remain state parties committed to the promotion and defense of justice and peace values that contributed to the creation of the International Criminal Court.
That was Sidiki Kaba, President of the Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute, calling for constructive dialogue around the International Criminal Court. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to add more perspective to Africa's proposed ICC exit, I have expert guest standing by. In Johannesburg, Alan Ngari is a researcher in the Transnational Threat and International Crimes Division at the Institute for Security Studies. In Nairobi, Dr. Adam Zolo, he's a political science lecturer at the University of Nairobi. In London, Dr. David Hoyle, he's a director of the Africa Research Center. And with me in studio, Jeremiah Kioni, a politician and former running mate of the in the last presidential election. Welcome to the program. I'll start with you, Alan Ngari. In Johannesburg, though, African countries have begun the process of withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. Burundi, the Gambia and South Africa have joined in the fray together with Kenya. Where does this leave Africa and the ICC as we speak?
Yes, thank you. Let me start by first saying that this decision by these governments in Africa to withdraw, some to indicate an intention, others have gone ahead to put out instruments of withdrawal, such as South Africa, is ill-advised, and the manner in which it has been done as well is of great concern, and particularly because we know that in the continent there is a very few mechanisms that would address international crimes. So the submission is really that this is an ill-advised move by the African states and it needs to be reconsidered.
Right, Dr. Hoyle, is this an ill-advised move by African states?
No, I think it's a great day, not only for Africa, but also, in fact, for international justice. The ICC was not a package that many African countries actually joined up for initially. It's actually shown itself in the last 10, 15 years to be a corrupt and broken court. So the sooner it actually removes itself from the international stage, the better. This is a court that is not independent. It is a court that in fact has shown itself to be an instrument of European foreign policy within Africa. It's also, unfortunately, the best possible advert for a war criminal. If you were a war criminal, you would want a court like the ICC, which is so patently corrupt and so patently failed. It's actually been an insult to international justice. And I think the moves that African states have made, and there will be many more, I think are very, very welcome and to an extent overdue.
Right, Dr. Adam Zolo, your thoughts, is this long overdue?
Well, I think that one has to have a balance in answering this question. One has to look at the fact that when most of the African states joined in, most of them thought that it was a way of addressing the challenges they face within their own countries. And therefore, you'll find that, as has been said before, most of the cases before ICC have been from Africa. But you'll also find that most of the referrals to that ICC were from African heads of states or governments. Africa only changed team when their own heads of states started to be paraded before that court, like when Bashir was paraded, and when President Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto were also indicted. To that extent, you'll find that both sides of the divide have an argument that like cases have not been treated alike, and therefore Africa will say that they are being targeted. On the other hand, you'll say that Africans were okay with the ICC as long as the heads of states were not touched.
Right. Jeremiah Kioni, you made the motion for withdrawal of Kenya in the last parliament. Your thoughts?
And we did so together with the then governor, the then member of parliament for Chaparugu, now governor of Bomet, Isaac Ruto. And it was because when we were signing the Rome Statute, there was a lot of hope. And certainly we are coming from a very desperate situation as Kenyan. But the way investigations were conducted and the way they commenced investigation in this country, where it was clear that they were trying to do political balancing between two political sides, they clearly told us that we will not achieve what we ever intended to achieve through ICC. And now that we have a new constitution in place, our constitution will give us better results than we would ever have gotten from ICC.
Right. Alan Gary, though, I now go back to South Africa's position there, and of course across the continent there is divided sentiment as to whether Africa should actually withdraw or Africa should stay in the, within the Rome Statute. What are your thoughts particularly on South Africa's situation?
Thank you. You know, I think it's important to have a nuanced approach to this debate. And while it's easy to have emotive arguments and talk about neocolonization, talk about Africa being targeted and all, it's important to have a principled approach to this situation, that is African states being a party to the Rome Statute. The reason why African states joined the ICC is to join the rest of the world in saying no more. We do not want international crimes to go unaccounted for. The victims of international crimes must get redress. So when African states pull out of the ICC statute, we are creating an impunity gap. We are saying that we are not creating avenues where investigations, prosecution and adjudication of crimes will happen. We all know that without these laws in place, then it is impossible to take anybody to court. African states do not have sufficient legislation to investigate, prosecute and try international crimes. Outside of the Rome Statute system, then it is difficult for us to bring an end to international crimes in the continent.
Dr. David Hall, do you agree that Africans do not have the sufficient legal way to deal with crimes of war crimes or other crimes within the continent?
No, I think that's a fallacious argument, if I may say so. The African Union itself is actually powering ahead with an African Union court, in effect, to deal with many of these issues. There's nothing nuanced about the fact that the ICC is a racist court. Every single one of the situations, every single one of the people that have been indicted have been African. This is ignoring a huge, wide-scale alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a member state of the ICC, so every single alleged war crime committed in Afghanistan by Western countries, NATO countries, comes under the orbit of the ICC. The ICC is deafeningly silent on all these issues. The simple fact also is that those African countries that joined the ICC have been sold a false bill of goods. The ICC they joined up to is not the ICC they saw before themselves over the last 10 years or so.
Alan Gary, can you address that issue of the biased nature of the court? Is the court actually biased, or is that being blown out of proportion?
I think your specific question to David Hall was whether there is sufficient legislation in Africa to address international crimes, which he has failed to answer conclusively. The African Court Protocol that he refers to, that was passed by the African Union heads of state and government in July 2014, has yet to attain a single ratification by any African states. So there isn't an international court, international crimes protocol that would allow for investigation, prosecution, and trial of crimes at the African Court. It's been 2 years, almost 2.5 years, since the Malabo Protocol was signed, but we have not seen a single state ratify it. We have 9 signatories, and that's the end of it. Outside of that, from a regional perspective, nationally, these 54 states, very few of them have legislation that would actually allow for the trial of international crimes. It's wonderful to talk about bias outside, but if we do not specifically hone in on the mechanisms that are required to address international crime specifically, then unfortunately it's all hot air.
Let me get your perspective here, Dr. Adams Olo, on the issues of racism and biased nature of the court and what the gentlemen on this program have mentioned.
Well, basically, there are two sides of debate. I think the most common one that usually comes at the forefront is that who has been tried. And the fact is that it is Africans who have mostly been tried by this court. The next question that one would ask themselves is who has referred these cases? More than 3/4 of them were referred by African governments. And thirdly, the question to ask is that at what point did Africa feel that the court was shortchanging it? It was only when heads of state in Africa started to be tried by this court. So I think that there is hypocrisy on both sides of the court and also of the African heads of state. And I can hypothesize that were it to be that Bashir was not tried or the Kenyan indictees who are both president and deputy to be not indicted, maybe Africa would not have raised the issues it is raising now. I can also say that Uganda, which referred cases to the ICC, later changed its mind simply because their head of state could have been next on the line. But that is not to wish away the fact that ICC has not treated other cases alike. As the colleague in London did mention, there is what is happening in Iraq, there is Syria, there is Afghanistan, and therefore on both sides of the divide you can say that there have been shortcomings here.
Jeremiah Kioni, I'll get your point here. At what point did Kenya begin to feel that it was being changed by the ICC, notably because Kenya's president and his deputy were both before the court at some point?
Specifically at the point at which it became clear that ICC was being used as a political tool by other countries outside Kenya to determine the political leadership in our country. And it was so clear, we were even told that choices have consequences coming from outside this country, and ICC was to determine who was to be the president and even the political arrangement in the country. And for that reason, whatever it is that we intended to achieve from ICC, we were not going to get it. We wanted justice for the victims, but that was not coming at all. And we could see the way investigations were done. Ocampo himself would come into the country and would talk to only one side of the political divide. When we look at the people who were arraigned outside in the ICC from this country, some had nothing to do with the difficulties that we had, but they needed to do some political balancing. You don't do political balancing when you're looking for criminal justice.
Right. Dr. Hoyle, what is the way forward now? Where does Africa go from here?
Well, the way ahead is exactly the one that has now started to unfold. South Africa, I think, has actually cast the final stone in that sense. The ICC is broken the second South Africa leaves that organization. The way ahead is that ultimately, even if there isn't an African Union court in place, African countries have sovereignty. It is up to them ultimately to decide how they actually legislate, how they deal with conflict. Right. We were able to do this in Britain with a 30-year civil war in Northern Ireland. The British Parliament decided to end it and to actually have amnesty and so on and so forth to end that conflict. It's up to African countries sovereign African countries ultimately to deal with the conflicts within their own borders.
Alan Gary, I want to get your view on this. Has South Africa's withdrawal put that final nail in the ICC's coffin? And what is the way forward here, and what is the way forward for Africa?
Let me say that the process or the manner in which the South African executive, and we must make the distinction that it is not the South African government that has withdrawn from the ICC statute, but it is the executive that has lodged instruments of withdrawal to the Secretary General of the United Nations. What has happened, or what should have happened domestically in this country, is that the executive ought to have taken this withdrawal intent through to the National Parliament and through to the National Council of Provinces, as well as a public consultation process, and only with the sanction of those three processes would then the executive constitutionally be able to lodge this withdrawal instrument at the United Nations. So what African states need to do is to revert to the mechanisms that are already present within the Rome Statute to address their concerns. Article 119 of the Rome Statute is very clear that where there are contestations or disputes within the states parties themselves, that they can solve those issues internally, failure to which then they can refer the matter to the Assembly of States Parties, and if the Assembly of States Parties is unable then to resolve the dispute, we can invite, or they can invite, the International Court of Justice then to intervene in the situation. But let me also tell you that these concerns by African states are valid concerns. They are not to be easily to be put offhand. I think that there is a hypocrisy in the international criminal justice system, but it is not a function of the working of the International Criminal Court per se, but it's the structure with which we find ourselves in. There are three ways of bringing cases to the court, one of which is the United Nations Security Council, and we have been calling for reform of the Security Council in such a way that it is representative of the geopolitics of the world. At present, the Security Council has powers under the statute to defer and send cases to the court. So it is that mechanism that needs to be addressed, and African states have stated this quite categorically. What I'm saying is that they need to exhaust the avenues within the Rome Statute system itself before taking the steps to withdraw.
Right, Alan Gary, thank you very much for your insight, and we're going to leave it there this week on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Alan Gary, researcher in the Transnational Threats and International Crimes Division at the Institute for Security Studies. In Nairobi, Dr. Adam Solo, political science lecturer at the University of Nairobi. And in London, Dr. David Hoyle, director of the Africa Research Center. In studio with me, Jeremiah Kioni, a former politician. Thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa. But do remember, you can continue this conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.